On the morning of August 15th, 2006, in the quiet and usually calm town of Bells Falls, Montana, an incident occurred that quickly attracted the attention of local authorities. Richard and Elizabeth Wilson's neighbor, an elderly man named Henry Clark, noticed something strange. The Wilson house, usually full of life, looked unusually quiet. The curtains were closed and no movement was visible inside. For several hours, Henry watched the house, waiting for at least one of the spouses to appear. But he never saw anyone. Around 10 a.m., Henry decided to check if everything was okay. He walked up to the house and knocked on the door. There was no answer. He tried to open the door, but it was locked. Concerned, Henry went to the window and tried to look inside, but the curtains were drawn tightly. At this point, he decided that something was clearly wrong and called the police. The patrol team arrived at the scene around 10:30. Officers attempted to contact the occupants of the home but were unsuccessful. When no one answered the door, the decision was made to open it. Upon entering the house, the police immediately sensed a tense atmosphere. There was a strange smell in the air that instantly made them uneasy. The patrolmen began to inspect the premises and soon found traces of blood on the floor of the first floor leading up the stairs. Having risen to the second floor, the officers found themselves in front of the bedroom door, which was slightly open. Inside the room, they saw a terrible picture. The bodies of two people were lying on the bed. The woman and man were dead, apparently killed several times at point-blank range. Blood soaked the sheets, and the scene was so terrible that the police immediately realized that they were facing a double murder. The police immediately blocked off the crime scene and called forensic experts. The Wilsons' houses and the surrounding area were cordoned off, and evidence began to be collected. Forensic experts quickly arrived on the scene and began their work, trying to preserve every trace, every little detail that could help in the investigation. According to preliminary data, the murder occurred at night, around midnight. Detective Chief Inspector David Harper, who led the investigation, was on the scene within an hour. He was an experienced officer with years of experience in the homicide department. Harper carefully examined the scene and immediately realized that this was not a simple matter. There were no signs of forced entry or robbery. This indicated that the killer knew his victims and was confident that he could carry out the crime without fanfare. Initial investigations of the crime scene revealed several important details. Firstly, no signs of a struggle were found at the scene. This meant that the victims were likely shot while they were asleep or in a helpless state. Secondly, cartridge casings were found on the floor next to the bed, indicating that the shots had been fired from a firearm. However, the weapon itself was not found at the site. Detective Harper immediately contacted local police to see if they knew anything about the relationship between the victims. The deceased woman was identified as Elizabeth Wilson, and the man was identified as John Randolph, a local businessman known for his connections in the city. Elizabeth's husband, Richard Wilson, was absent at the time, and his whereabouts remained unknown. Detectives began collecting information about the last days of the victims' lives. They interviewed neighbors who confirmed that they had often seen John at the Wilsons' house recently. This immediately raised suspicions among investigators about a possible love triangle that could lead to such a brutal crime. However, detectives did not yet have enough information to draw conclusions. One of the first questions that needed to be answered was where Richard Wilson was at the time of the murder. Was this crime the work of a third party, or could Richard himself be involved in the murder of his wife and her lover? From that moment on, a large-scale investigation began, the goal of which was to find out what happened in this quiet house on the outskirts of Montana on that fateful night. Following the discovery of bodies in the Wilson home, the case was handed over to detectives David Harper and his partner, Sarah Miller. The first hours after a murder are always critical to an investigation, and detectives knew that every minute counted. They had to determine who could be behind this terrible crime and what the motive was. The first step was to establish the exact time of death. A medical examiner at the scene determined that the victims were killed sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. This information narrowed the time frame for the investigation and gave detectives an idea of when exactly the murder occurred. Detectives began interviewing nearby neighbors and friends of the Wilson family. Henry Clark, a neighbor who discovered the lack of activity in the house, said he heard muffled sounds on the night of the murder, but did not think anything of them. Other neighbors did not notice anything suspicious, except that in recent weeks, Richard and Elizabeth rarely left the house together. Particular attention was paid to clarifying the relationship between the victims. It turned out that Elizabeth Wilson and John Randolph had a close relationship that clearly went beyond friendship. This immediately suggested that jealousy could be the motive for the murder. But despite this, detectives decided not to rush to conclusions. The next step in the investigation was to locate Richard Wilson. He was a key figure in the case, the husband of one of the victims and the man who might have had the most obvious motive for the murder. But Richard was nowhere to be found. His mobile phone was switched off and none of his friends or relatives knew where he was. This disappearance only increased suspicions. Detectives began studying CCTV footage from the city's main streets and the road leading to the Wilsons' home. They hoped to find at least one frame that would show Richard or his car. This analysis took several hours, but the effort paid off. On one of the cameras installed near the house, a car similar to Richard's was seen driving into the street around midnight. This recording confirmed that Richard was near the house at a time close to the alleged time of the murder. However, this was not enough for the prosecution. More evidence was required of his involvement in the crime. Meanwhile, detectives continued to gather information about John Randolph. He was known in the city as a successful and well-connected businessman, but he also had enemies. It turned out that a few months ago he was involved in a lawsuit involving business partners, and this caused a lot of conflicts. This fact led detectives to consider the possibility that the murder could be related to his professional activities. At this stage of the investigation, the detectives faced two main directions: Richard's jealousy, which could lead to murder, or John's business conflicts, which could serve as a motive for eliminating both. More evidence should have been collected to rule out one of these versions. Particular attention was paid to studying the crime scene. Forensic experts carefully examined all the rooms where there could be traces of the presence of unauthorized persons. Several fingerprints were found that did not belong to the victims, indicating the possibility of a third party. These prints were sent for analysis, but until the results were received, detectives continued to work on other leads. The detectives' next task was to find Richard Wilson and interview him to find out what happened that night. To do this, they began coordinating with other police departments and extended inquiries about his whereabouts to neighboring states. The case became more and more complicated, and detectives realized that the investigation would be long and complex. But they had enough experience and determination to solve this mystery and find who was behind this double murder. Detectives David Harper and Sarah Miller continued to delve deeper into the investigation, realizing that solving this case would require collecting every piece of evidence possible. Time was against them. The longer the killer remained unsolved, the greater the chance that he would have time to escape or cover his tracks. The first step was a more thorough investigation of the crime scene. Forensic investigators returned to the Wilson home to look for any small details that might have been missed during the initial inspection. During the re-examination, they discovered several interesting clues. A toolbox was found in the garage, and minor blood was found on one of the hammers, which did not match the blood of the victims. This hammer became important evidence that could link the criminal to the crime scene. Detectives also noticed strange shoe prints found on the living room carpet. These footprints varied in size, indicating the presence of at least two people in the house at the time of the murder. However, at this stage of the investigation, it was still unclear who exactly these traces belonged to. The next step was to study the victims' phone records. Elizabeth and John's mobile phones were sent for examination to recover deleted messages and calls. The results showed that on the night of the murder, Elizabeth tried to call Richard several times, but his phone was switched off. In addition, among the deleted messages, correspondence was found that indicated that Elizabeth was planning to break up with Richard and start a new life with John. These messages could have served as a motive for murder if Richard found out about them. At the same time, detectives began to check Richard's financial situation. An examination of his bank accounts revealed that he had withdrawn a significant amount of money in the weeks before the murder. This money could have been used to prepare for a crime or to try to escape. This fact increased suspicions of his involvement in the murder. Detectives also began analyzing footage from surveillance cameras installed in the area. Although footage of Richard's car had already been found, They were looking for further evidence of his presence in the area on the night of the murder. One of the recordings, taken near a gas station, showed a car very similar to his, but this time the driver was a man who was probably not Richard. This detail gave detectives reason to believe that Richard might have an accomplice. Sarah Miller, while researching John Randolph's connections, discovered that he had a conflictual relationship with one of his former business partners. This man lost a large sum of money several years ago due to John's decisions and repeatedly threatened him. Detectives began to consider the possibility that the murder could be the result of revenge, but there was not yet enough evidence to link the man to the murder. During the investigation, police also checked vehicles registered in Richard's name. They discovered that his car had been recently polished, which could have been an attempt to hide blood or other evidence. The examination showed that traces of blood were indeed found on the seat upholstery, indicating that the car could have been used to transport bodies or evidence. At this point in the investigation, detectives began to form a picture of events, but until now they had no direct evidence that could conclusively link Richard to the murder. However, the amount of circumstantial evidence accumulated, and this forced the investigation to focus more and more on his figure. Detectives also began receiving results from DNA tests conducted at the crime scene. Traces of blood found on the hammer and in the car belonged to Elizabeth, confirming her presence in these places. However, there were still many questions to be answered. As the investigation continued, tensions grew in the city. People were waiting for an answer to the question, who committed this terrible crime and why? Public opinion was inclined to believe that Richard was guilty, but detectives did not yet have all the necessary evidence to bring him to trial. At this stage of the investigation, Detectives Harper and Miller realized that they had to act even faster and more decisively in order not to miss any important details. Their task became more and more difficult, but they knew that every step brought them closer to solving this complicated story. By mid-August, the investigation into the murders of Elizabeth Wilson and John Randolph was progressing, but there were still gaps that detectives David Harper and Sarah Miller were trying to fill. The evidence implicating Richard Wilson grew, but direct evidence of his guilt was lacking. At this point, contradictions began to appear in the investigation, which forced the detectives to reconsider some of their assumptions. Contradictions in testimony. One of the key elements in the investigation was the testimony of witnesses who may have seen Richard on the night of the murder. However, the more people detectives questioned, the more inconsistencies arose. For example, one neighbor claimed to have seen a car similar to Richard's leaving his house around 11 p.m., which supported Richard's alibi, but other witnesses insisted that his car was at the house until midnight. These contradictions in testimony could mean that someone was deliberately confusing the investigation by creating false alibis for Richard. This led detectives to wonder whether Richard might have had an accomplice who was helping him cover up the crime or creating false leads. Expertise and new evidence. Meanwhile, forensic scientists continued to work on the evidence collected at the crime scene. One of the key pieces of evidence was a hammer with blood found in the garage. Additional examination revealed that traces of sweat were found on the handle of the hammer, which did not belong to any of the victims. This suggested that the hammer may have been used by the killer or an accomplice to cover his tracks, prompting further DNA analysis. DNA test results confirmed that sweat marks on the hammer belonged to Richard Wilson. This important discovery increased suspicions against him, but also created a new problem. If he really was the killer, why didn't he try to get rid of the hammer that might give him away? Financial contradictions. Detectives also delved into Richard's financial situation. An analysis of his bank accounts revealed several unusual transactions. 2 weeks before the murder, he transferred a significant amount of money to an account registered in the name of a third party. These transactions were suspicious, and detectives began to look into who this third party might be and how he was connected to Richard. Upon further investigation, it turned out that the owner of the account, one George Martin, was associated with criminal activity in the past and had repeatedly come to the attention of the police for his involvement in fraud and extortion. This discovery gave the investigation a new direction. Perhaps George was involved in the murder, or he helped Richard hide it. The emergence of a new suspect. While detectives worked on the George Martin case, they began to delve deeper into his connections and possible motives. It turned out that John Randolph had a business relationship with George several years ago and may have owed him something. This fact was not previously known and could explain why John was at the murder scene. The investigation revealed that for several months before the murder, John and George had been negotiating a joint project that never materialized. Witnesses claimed that serious differences arose between them and their business relationship deteriorated. This could have been a motive for revenge on George's part. New twist in the case. Detectives were now considering the possibility that the murder could be the work of a professional hired to kill John and Elizabeth, and Richard could either be involved in the crime or be used as a cover. However, more evidence needed to be found to confirm this version. The collected contradictory evidence, new evidence, and the appearance of the figure of George Martin led the investigation to a new stage. Now, the detectives realized that the case was much more complicated than it seemed at first glance. Their task was to collect all the pieces of the puzzle and find out who was behind this murder and what his true motives were. At this point, the investigation became more complex, but detectives Harper and Miller were determined to see it through to the end and find who was responsible for the deaths of Elizabeth and John. By this point, the investigation had become particularly complex, and detectives David Harper and Sarah Miller were faced with a number of new questions that had to be answered. Evidence against Richard Wilson was mounting, but the emergence of a new suspect, George Martin, brought an unexpected twist to the case. Detectives knew they needed to figure out how Martin might be connected to the murder and how his motives fit into the overall picture of the crime. Interrogation of George Martin. The first step was to find and interrogate George Martin. Given his criminal history, detectives decided to approach this with caution. Martin was known to be a cunning and cautious man who knew how to evade the attention of law enforcement. When detectives discovered his whereabouts, they immediately made an arrest and took him to the station for questioning. When questioned, Martin initially denied any connection to the murder. He claimed that he had not been in contact with either John Randolph or Richard Wilson for a long time and had nothing to do with what happened. However, detectives showed him evidence of financial transfers from Richard to his account. Martin was unable to provide a satisfactory explanation for these transactions, which made investigators even more suspicious. Martin became nervous when detectives asked him about his business relationship with John Randolph. He tried to avoid answering directly, but eventually admitted that he did have business differences with John that led to a serious conflict. However, he continued to insist that he had nothing to do with the murder. Disclosure of new information. While Martin was in custody, detectives continued to investigate his financial dealings and connections. While reviewing the documents, they discovered that Martin had withdrawn a large amount of cash from his bank account several days before the murder. This money could have been used to pay a hitman or to bribe someone who could help cover up the crime. Detectives also learned that Martin was in town the night of the murder, despite his initial statements to the contrary. This discovery made him the prime suspect in the case. However, detectives knew they needed more evidence to link him to the crime scene. Search for new evidence. Detectives decided to return to the crime scene with new knowledge. They reviewed all the evidence and tried to find traces that could indicate Martin's presence in the house that night. Upon re-examination, they found fine strands of fiber on John Randolph's clothing that did not match any other clothing found in the house. These fibers were sent for analysis, and the results showed that they could have come from a coat or jacket that Martin usually wore. This evidence was an important element in supporting the theory that Martin may have been in the house at the time of the murder. However, detectives still needed to figure out exactly how he was involved in the crime. Richard's confession. At this time, under pressure from new evidence and the realization that the investigation was getting closer to the truth, Richard Wilson decided to change his tactics. He agreed to meet with detectives and expressed a desire to make a confession. During interrogation, Richard said that he learned about his wife's affair with John Randolph and was furious. However, he said, he did not plan to kill them. Richard admitted that he hired George R.R. Martin to intimidate John into leaving Elizabeth's life. He claimed that he did not know that Martin would commit murder. Richard said that he transferred money to Martin as payment for his services, but the murder came as a surprise to him. Final steps in the investigation. After this confession, the investigation took a new direction. Detectives began checking Richard's testimony, comparing it with other evidence. They also examined phone calls and messages between Richard and Martin in the days leading up to the murder and found that they were indeed in frequent contact discussing details of the meeting with John. Meanwhile, investigators continued to collect evidence against Martin, trying to prove that he deliberately killed John and Elizabeth, exceeding his authority. Fibers found at crime scenes and financial transfers played a key role in this process. As detectives prepared to file final charges, the case became clearer. Martin probably acted on his own, deciding to eliminate John Randolph to solve his problems, and killed Elizabeth as a possible witness. However, the investigation still had many questions that had to be answered before the case was fully solved. With Richard Wilson's confession and additional evidence against George Martin, the case finally began to come together. Detectives David Harper and Sarah Miller knew they were in the final stages of their investigation and needed to pull all the clues together to finally solve this complex crime. Final interrogation and arrest. After receiving a confession from Richard, detectives decided to conduct a final interrogation of George Martin. Now, armed with new evidence, they were ready to bring specific charges against him. During the interrogation, Harper and Miller presented Martin with the results of an analysis of fibers found on John Randolph's clothing and financial records proving transfers from Richard. Under pressure from new evidence and the realization that his situation had become hopeless, Martin finally confessed. He said he initially agreed to Richard's proposal to intimidate John, but the situation got out of control. When he arrived at the meeting place, a fight broke out between him and John Randolph, which resulted in Martin, fearing exposure, shooting John. Elizabeth, who became an unwitting witness, was killed out of fear that she would inform the police. Martin's confession was a key point in the case. Detectives now had all the evidence they needed to charge him with double murder. Richard Wilson was also found to be an accomplice in the crime, as his actions in hiring Martin and financial support played a direct role in the incident. Closing the case. After the confession and arrest of George Martin, the case moved to the judicial level. Both defendants appeared in court. The prosecution presented all the evidence collected, including Richard and Martin's confessions, telephone records, financial transactions, and forensic results. The trial was short since the prosecution had a sufficient evidence base. George Martin was found guilty of the premeditated murder of 2 people and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Richard Wilson, who pleaded guilty to organizing the crime, received a long prison sentence for complicity in aiding. The closure of the case was an important event for the residents of Bells Falls. The town, shocked by the brutality of the murder, finally received answers to the questions that had plagued them throughout the investigation. Despite the harsh sentences, this case left an indelible mark on people's hearts, reminding them that even in the quietest places, dark secrets can lurk. For detectives David Harper and Sarah Miller, completing this case was a testament to their professionalism and perseverance. An investigation that began with a seemingly simple case of jealousy has evolved into a complex and multi-layered story, requiring in-depth analysis and understanding of human nature. Closing this case not only gave them satisfaction for their work, but also experience they can use in future investigations. The murder case of Elizabeth Wilson and John Randolph was closed, but its echoes will reverberate throughout Bells Falls for a long time, reminding us that even the most seemingly harmless people can be drawn into dark and dangerous games.